Good day. My name is Brian Smith, and I'm a supply chain security specialist assigned to the Newark field office. I've been assigned to CTPAT since 2006. I will be receptive of any feedback as we plan to put out more presentations on the Cyber MSC on a regular basis. In developing this presentation, I was assisted by the CBP Cybersecurity Directorate, and they will be involved in future presentations on the Cyber MSC. I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I do see myself as somewhat of a translator. I understand the makeup of the audience. The typical connections we as specialists have with our partners typically begins with the points of contacts or POCs. And typically they have no cybersecurity experience, but they are often the ones that within their organizations have to monitor all the departments to ensure their compliance with their respective areas of the minimum security criteria they control. Typically, POCs are intermediaries where they observe areas of weakness with respect to the MSC and often have to make recommendations to upper management for funding and resources to mitigate those weaknesses. To accomplish this with respect to the new cybersecurity MSC, I think it is important that we provide instruction on this new criteria so the POCs and others in our partner organizations have the tools they need to understand and apply the new criteria and provide an adequate level of oversight of their own IT departments and effectively accomplish these tasks when it comes to their foreign business partners, which is the core of this program's mission. Over the past several years, I've been compiling results from foreign and domestic site visits relevant to cybersecurity. During that time, I was asking the companies I visited many questions that you now see in the new Cyber MSC. I have seen the levels of compliance for large and small companies, and that affords me a better perspective for identifying which areas of this new MSC need additional instruction for effective implementation. It is our aim to provide our partners with information and resources that will allow them to fully implement the new cyber-related criteria, but more importantly, communicate this to their foreign partners and ensure they are also fully compliant. The new Cyber MSC is very necessary and gives the program the tools it needs to be more in line with the current governmental and industry norms. Cybersecurity is ever increasing in importance, as we see in media reports. In another presentation, I will try to show just how some of the largest hacks or breaches were carried out by hackers and how in many cases the vulnerabilities that were compromised could have been secured via somewhat simple means. I will show sometimes it is simple errors by a few employees or just one employee or a third-party vendor down the supply chain that can lead to a significant and devastating breach. The first presentation is focused squarely on user authentication. It is the aim of this presentation to familiarize CTPAT POCs with MSC 4.8 or user authentication methods. In order to do that, I want to touch briefly on policy requirements, which are spelled out specifically in MSC 4.1, which is a very important and welcomed addition to the new MSC. I will then give a brief background on the evolution of the password. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will use the term legacy password. What that refers to are the passwords we have been basically using for about the past 18 years or so. And I'll go into more detail about that here in a few minutes. Then we will cover some training considerations that POCs and IT folks should incorporate into their internal training programs. The CTPAT elected to follow the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, or NIST's, guidelines with respect to user authentication, and we will talk more about that in upcoming slides. NIST is the federal agency that sets the standards that all other federal agencies must follow, and not just for cyber, but we will just focus obviously on the cyber aspect of NIST's role. But if they set standards for federal agencies, why is this applicable to all of you, and why did CTPAT elect to use their guidelines for this criteria? Well, because their standards are usually created with private industry in mind, and because of the vastness of the federal government, and coupled with the fact that most of their standards are developed in partnership with private industry, most often private industry follows suit and applies the NIST standards when applicable. And cyber is no exception, hence this is why we have all been creating passwords with between 6 and 8 characters, upper, lower, and all that baloney for the past 17 years. But that is changing, as you will see soon. And towards the end, we will finish up with a brief overview of password managers. But first, I do feel it's necessary to briefly discuss 4.1, which specifically addresses the need to have comprehensive written cybersecurity policies and/or procedures. There are two musts here in this criterion. The second must states that any IT policy must cover all the individual cybersecurity criteria. Before I go into this from a CTPAT perspective, I just want to point out that there are many legitimate resources online from government sources and other legitimate sources that can assist with developing internal cyber policies. I can't stress enough how important it is for a company, no matter the size, to have cybersecurity/IT policies and acceptable use policies. This discussion on 4.1 will be brief because I plan on having an entire presentation dedicated to developing comprehensive cybersecurity policies in a future presentation release. But again, I want to stress the importance of having these policies in place. When we look at a small to mid-sized company that is either the direct CTPAT certified partner or when we are visiting a foreign supplier, we typically see the following type of organizational setup. There is usually a point of contact that is, well, the point person for administering all aspects of this program. Larger companies may have a dedicated team which includes representatives from all of the respective departments to include IT. But for the small to mid-sized companies, which we refer to as SMB, most of those companies have a point person who then reaches out to the other department heads and basically ensures they are aware of the program's requirements and provides oversight in that they ensure those departments are maintaining compliance with the program's criteria through a variety of means. But if a robust policy, procedure, SOP is not in place, then the POC or the managers that have oversight responsibilities cannot effectively measure the IT department's compliance levels. This is evidenced by results from recent validations and is also applicable to other areas of the MSC. That is why I typically recommend that companies have, at a minimum, separate policies for IT, the IT department, and for the employees, which we typically call acceptable use policies or AUP. As we go through this presentation, I will point out specific items that I highly recommend should be placed in a policy and the reason why it should be. Too many policies I've seen are too vague or boilerplate, or they borrow them or steal them from somebody else. That hinders a POC's ability to effectively gauge their IT department's compliance with this program's requirements. And again, I am for the most part referring to the SMBs, but I have seen this problem in larger companies around the world where the IT department lacks adequate oversight, whether IT services are provided by in-house personnel or via a third-party vendor or a mixture of both. Even if IT services are outsourced, that does not alleviate the CTPAT partner of the responsibilities respective of the program's requirements being met. AUPs must be put in place to provide employees with rules of behavior with respect to IT. Too many AUPs I've seen are too vague or lack any teeth. As we go through this presentation and following presentations, I think you will see exactly what I mean when I point out what should be included in a robust AUP. It should also point out what the employer is responsible for, what an employee should do in certain situations, and also potential hazards. MSC, by the way, 1.2 specifically recommends that each company should create a team that draws representatives from throughout the company. All too often I see that the IT department is left out and does not have a seat at the table. I am often still surprised to see this is the case even at some of the larger companies I visit. Many times it is imperative that companies be inclusive of IT personnel and develop these policies with the criteria in mind. Policies should be reviewed on a regular basis as a team, especially after a breach or significant event. The policy should be scrutinized. Was it effective? Did it give managers and decision makers and IT personnel the tools they needed? If the policy was written better, could that have staved off the incident in the first place? Did an incident occur because employees were not adequately briefed on the policy, or did it not include procedures relevant to a specific situation that led to a breach or suspicious activity? Lessons learned, changes, edits should all be considered when updating the policy. As a specialist, that is something I want to see at a validation. that the policy is not only in place, but it is effectively communicated to all relevant staff members, and that it is not static and is relevant to the company being visited or validated. Again, I am happy that this criterion was included in a new rollout of the MSC. And I wouldn't spend time on this if I didn't see this as a problem amongst the trade that we visit around the world. It is. And this is also reflected in research papers, surveys, and cyber media publications. I hope to spend more time on this specific subject in future presentations where I will provide sample IT policies which will parallel the criteria and will show how a company, large or small, can tailor it to suit their needs. So again, throughout this and future presentations, I will be pointing out which topics should be inserted and tracked in a policy and which topics should be inserted into training. On this slide is the entire criteria for 4.8. We will now go through each subcomponent individually. So now we do move into the first subpart, if you will, of MSC 4.8. I've conducted several cyber-focused presentations over the past 3 or 4 years, and I see there are always a few topics where after I announce the topic and get into it, I get confused looks from the audience. This is one of them. And yes, this is still a problem. I think that when I speak to people that work in the United States for U.S. companies, they don't realize that this is actually an issue that we see overseas quite often. What happens is these companies allow all employees to sign into the network using one common username and password combination. This is what's called a shared account. Shared accounts have less accountability associated than non-shared accounts. Privileged shared accounts let me say that again. Privileged shared accounts run a higher risk to an organization since their compromise might not be noticed as quickly. A shared account is one account or username and multiple users. I remember the first time I discovered this. It was a mid-sized trucking firm in Minnesota. And I was just asking the questions, and the owner, the usual IT questions, going through the order. And at some point, the owner gave me a response that made me pause for a second. When I asked him about usernames, the response he gave me made me suspicious. But at first, I was kind of feeling like the audience members I previously described, like this doesn't really happen. This can't be happening, because it's kind of like so basic in some ways. So on a hunch, I guess you could say, I asked him this question several times in several different ways because I was surprised and couldn't believe that a company with a few hundred drivers and a business office with about 40 employees was doing this. But they were. And after this happened, this topic became a permanent question in my standard cyber questionnaire. And since that time, I see this about 2 or 3 times a year. And this was to log into their business network. This wasn't for like a standalone machine or something like that. This was for, using all their run-of-the-mill standard trucking software applications. And we're going to get into that here in a minute. Next. So it is important that CTPAT partners ensure their foreign partners are also aware of this requirement, that all users have their own unique username and never share their login credentials with anyone. For many, the potential pitfalls are obvious. Allowing employees to share credentials or have one common username for all employees makes it all but impossible for anyone to really be able to track and trace activity logs. When I dug deeper, I even saw that some companies were using the same practice to log into their ERPs, dispatch software, or web-based dispatching solutions. Again, this is critical, and if being practiced, enhances significantly the internal threat and places undue burden of suspicion on the IT department and basically all the employees, and that if something does happen, then automatically all the employees are under suspicion. Further, we as specialists often see weak termination procedures. And if we see that their termination procedures are weak, we lack confidence in that company's ability to change the common password upon the departure of an employee. Further to that, Having multiple people using one username password combo significantly increases the possibility that those credentials will be compromised. By any measure, this is bad practice, very bad practice, and I'm glad to see this in the criteria. So on this slide, you can see some of the potential pitfalls associated with shared accounts. So consider this. You manage a trucking company operating along the U.S. border. CBP seizes narcotics in the trailer. An investigation ensues by CBP and HSI, and then CTPAT conducts post-incident analysis, or PIA. At a minimum, we're going to want to see the items you listed on this slide that you see here. Documentation, GPS data, web or software-based dispatch logs, the seal numbers, manifest data, and any CCTV video. So if you are allowing your dispatchers and other groups to use shared accounts, the data we do collect will have not as much value, if any. And this is just one example. I'm not going to give you many examples, but I think this one's a good one to drive the point home. I still have companies that I go to, and one was a large tech company that I validated last fall. And I asked them, do you switch or did you change the default password on your CCTV network? And they said no. And I said, I know because I see your cameras on a website that basically posts live feeds of all the camera feeds that they say are hacked, but they're not really, not all of them are really hacked. They are because people know the default passwords for all the major camera manufacturers in the world, and then they post this stuff online. And I've done that a few times over the years. So just a little aside there, just a little story there. Now, on to the second sub part of this criterion, and probably the most important part of this presentation, passwords, user authentication. We all kind of think of this as the password criterion, but we need to change our focus to the current cyber landscape, the current language that is used, in that the old ways are just that, old, and more importantly, outdated, misunderstood, and a major contributing factor in breaches and suspicious activity. Today, we see a migration from what I term, for this presentation, the legacy password. And so we see a migration from that legacy password to more sophisticated and secure methods of what is now referred to as user authentication. There are several ways a company can approach this in keeping with the CTPAT MSC, and I'm going to take you through these options. But before we delve into user authentication, I do believe it's important to give you a very short history on the evolution of the password. I do this during my live presentations, and I think it is helpful to the audience in understanding where we came from, how it all started, and why the need for changes, and hopefully convince companies to abandon the old, tired, and inadequate password. This will also help further explain our justification in following NIST's lead on this subject, instead of trying to develop our own user authentication policy from the ground up. So back around 2002, a man named Bill Burr, who worked for NIST, basically put out the guidelines that led to what I call, for the sake of this conversation, the legacy password. And you know what I'm talking about, the 6 to 8 characters, upper and lower case, et cetera, et cetera. Well, back in 2017, NIST, working in concert with Google and other top cyber companies, published a new set of guidelines. Mr. Burr went on a speaking tour to promote these changes, and he hit like all the major networks, TV networks. So you can actually look up those videos if you want. But he kind of made fun of himself in those videos because he knew how messed up the current password landscape is and how daunting it is and how confusing it is. And he said back in 2002 that he was wrong when he put out those initial guidelines. But really, when you read about this, many people in the cyber world today gave him a pass, and I tend to agree, because in 2002, that predated Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and the plethora of apps and programs we now use in 2020, and all the passwords that go along with it. He could not have foreseen the myriad problems that arose over that time since 2002. And the problem is this: we have to memorize an ever-increasing number of passwords. and we have been told we have to change them periodically, or if we think they were compromised. So human nature takes over, and we end up doing exactly what we shouldn't. We make them easier to remember. And I know I said I'll get to password managers later, but I still don't see a lot of people using them or using them the right way. They're still taking shortcuts. I've even asked people, what is your password to get into the password manager? And it's just awful what I hear. And I'll try and get to that later if I have time. And what ends up happening with all of this is something called password fatigue. So that led NIST to kind of rethink this whole user authentication landscape, if you will, and come to where we are now with the current thinking. So we as humans not only tend to make our passwords easier to remember, we make them easier to hack via a variety of means, which I don't have time to get into everything here, because a lot of that does go beyond the scope of this presentation. Plus, it would take another hour to do it, and I don't think you'd like that. So we also now tend to use the same passwords for multiple applications, websites, email. And to compound the issue, we use the same passwords for professional accounts and our personal accounts. And if it couldn't get any worse, there's more. We even send those passwords back and forth from our personal accounts to our professional accounts. We also send our passwords to coworkers so they can see our work and help on projects. We willingly give our passwords to people that call and ask for them over the phone. We click on links and emails that look legit, but we don't go the extra step to ensure the web address is legit. Then we end up going into a malicious site that looks and behaves exactly as the legitimate site, but when you enter your credentials, banking information, etc., it is actually being entered directly into the hacker's website. So are you scared yet? And that last paragraph there, that's a little taste of another presentation that I give on pen testing and network defense. Those things that I just told you we are all doing wrong is some of the first things that most of the top-rated pen testing groups or people look for or do to see if they can get into a company. It's not as sophisticated as you think in the beginning. They actually do some of that stuff that I just talked to you about when they're invited in to pen test a company. So on this slide here, 14, we have a lot to talk about. And we're going to talk about it on this slide and actually in the next slide or two. But we have a lot to talk about, and that's because many of you, and certainly many of your overseas partners, still use legacy passwords to log into all the solutions used on a daily basis to conduct business. The biggest problem I see during my validations, and this is certainly echoed in cyber research, is the lack of adequate training on how to create a truly strong password. Evidence shows this is true, and the numbers are quite staggering. I often see companies have policies that instruct employees to use strong passwords. Then I ask them how they ensure the employees are actually creating strong passwords, and if they provide instructions on how to create a strong password. I usually get an answer I don't like. And the next two slides really help to drive that point home. Many people, millions and millions and millions, actually are still using very simple legacy passwords. Every year since around 2012, a list is published showing the top passwords that were found being used in successful breaches. The top 10, 100, 1,000, even up to 100,000 rarely change, year in and year out. We see millions of users using passwords such as, wait for it, password, or better yet, password and the number 1. Or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They are all still being used. Now, every once in a while, well, actually in every presentation I gave, I get a giggle. But then I turn around and I ask the audience, I said, how confident are all of you that no one within your organization is using one of the passwords that you see on this screen? And I always get a few grimaces. I always get a few looks that tell me they are. So, again, this is why training and robust policies are so critical. Now, NIST and CTPAT in this criteria state that under this new guidance released in 2017, users no longer need to change their passwords regularly, every 60 or 90 days, which was the previous rule that we went by. But, and this is a big but, that comes with some very important caveats. Okay, and the next section is very important that you listen to all of these. These caveats must be met if you want to be the company that has employees using the old system of, the old legacy passwords I referred to, and not require them to change them. First, training. Again, you will just see how many millions right here in front of you people use the passwords on this slide. And these are just the passwords found extracted from what we call breach corpuses. Employees should be shown these slides. Okay, I have printouts of these two slides that I show companies that don't have good password hygiene or password practices or password training. And I tell them, you should show your employees this. These are not good passwords. These can be hacked in less than 1 second. So, again, I want to impress upon you the need to train employees on this subject. Incorporate it into policy. In one breach, they found that one person had a username of Kirk. And sure enough, his password was Captain. So, in-person cybersecurity training is critical. Almost every cybersecurity professional says that this is a priority, and it is typically at the top of their list. Sending out cybersecurity training and updates solely by email or short presentations is proven to be ineffective. A future presentation will cover what elements should be included in an effective cybersecurity presentation. And I know that by doing what we're doing today, I'm kind of contradicting myself, but we really do not have any other choice right now. So this slide is a very important slide. It really drives home the point in my opinion. Okay, and further, NIST also states that employees should be barred from using dictionary terms in their passwords. The entire dictionary and all those hacked passwords, so all the words in the dictionary plus all the hacked passwords are all incorporated into the hacking algorithms that are used by hackers and bought on the dark web or wherever they get the algorithms from. So now for those of you that think adding an exclamation point in place of the letter L or an ampersand to substitute the letter A or a $sign to substitute S is going to trip up a hacker, think again. Those special character substitutions do not slow down the hackers at all. They already know you're all doing that. Passwords should be totally random. Near the end of the presentation, we will talk again, briefly though, about password managers and how they can help generate strong random passwords. NIST also strongly recommends that every password, every prospective password, I guess you could say, is checked against a list of blacklisted passwords. Basically, all those passwords we have been talking about, the dictionary words, the ones that were found in breach corpuses, employees should be prohibited from using those passwords or any password that includes your company name, its acronyms, personal names, product names, street names associated with the company, etc. They should also be taught not to use the names of any famous sports players, sports teams, their dog, or their children. So, if all those conditions are met that we just talked about, then I would say, okay, you don't need to change your legacy passwords regularly, and then you would be in keeping with what NIST is putting out in guidance. But as I have seen over the past couple years, most companies I visit are not there yet. Those that are using only legacy passwords to get into the bulk of their network and apps and all the systems that they use. So that is our dilemma, and that is why NIST and CTPAT strongly recommend you all transition to longer passwords, and we're going to talk about that now. In its guidance, NIST strongly recommends allowing users to type longer passwords. Now look, there is no widely accepted standard for exactly how many characters you should be at, but generally anything over 12 is good, 20 is much better, as hacking algorithms have a much harder time cracking what we call the hash associated with the password's characters. I don't want to get into the woods too deeply, but we do know that when you start getting over 15 to 20 characters, hackers don't typically have the processing power to hack those passwords in a reasonable amount of time. Now, some do argue that if the hackers use what's called a botnet, which means they take control of the processing power of hundreds and sometimes thousands of computers, they can then get through brute force the passwords quicker. But generally, if you can allow employees to make longer passwords in excess of 15 to 20 characters, you are doing yourselves a huge favor. That takes us to the passphrase, which is still a form of what we call single-factor authentication. NIST, Google, and a whole host of other parties are strongly encouraging people to start using passphrases. First, the advantages. With passphrases, you do not need to worry about using dictionary words. You can use them, and actually it's encouraged. You don't need to use special characters, and actually NIST, in its guidance, discourages companies from placing arbitrary requirements on users to insert special characters because that would defeat the purpose of using a passphrase. Passphrases are meant to be, I memorize maybe 4 or 5 words that are unrelated, but no special character requirements that make it harder for me to memorize, which would end up making us go back to that password fatigue problem we talked about earlier, and we end up making something so simple again that it makes it easier for the hackers to break through again. So what is a passphrase? Well, it could be a couple things. It depends on how you have your password field set up within your company or within the applications, whatever, web applications, etc. NIST and CTPAT recommend that you allow at least up to 64 characters and possibly as high as 120, and allow for spaces, and that the spaces be counted towards the total character count. So on this slide is basically a summation of the passphrase. Again, I want to point out that this is strongly recommended by NIST. It eliminates many of the problems and hurdles that have to be overcome by using the legacy password, as I described earlier. In my experience, this is faster and cheaper to implement when compared to some of the other options we will discuss in a few slides. So, if you elect to transition to passphrases, you have to make sure that the employees are using a minimum of at least 12 characters. But strongly recommend that you work with your IT department and strive for 20, 25, or more characters, and include spaces as counted characters. Again, there is no actual hard and fast rule for the number of characters that should be required, but the more, the better is what's pretty much agreed upon. Keep in mind, too, that you should discuss this, and obviously we'll have to discuss this with IT. Now, on this slide, we see some examples. We see 3 variations of acceptable passphrases. No special characters are used here. And you're going to say, well, look at letter C, there's special characters. I'll get to that in a second. Example B shows us the same thing, but here spacing is not allowed, but this is still strong, but just not as strong as A. Okay, so in A, that's where if spaces are permitted. B, there are no spaces permitted. So B isn't as strong as A. All right. There are all sorts of creative ways people can use to come up with these random words, and that's basically this kind of a passphrase composition. That is what the experts are saying you should do. Picking 4 to 5 totally unrelated words. And you would not believe that if you try to break through this, or if you put these words into a password strength meter, it gets into the hundreds of thousands of years and sometimes even hundreds of millions of years, especially when you get closer to sentences like C that we're going to talk about now. The FBI also published a widely circulated tutorial on this. So example C is probably the strongest overall, and it is a passphrase written as a sentence. Now, I selected a line out of a song I like, but you can create any sentence, but the key is this. If your company permits spacing and use of punctuation marks, then write the sentence just as you would in an email. So I'm not contradicting what I said earlier. The company, or the IT department is not forcing the employee using C to use that punctuation. That is natural punctuation you would write to write a good sentence, or a grammatically correct sentence. Okay? As a matter of fact, the strength rises exponentially with the sentence like C being used. Okay? So again, A is good, B is better, C is best. Okay? NIST and CTPAT also encourage the use of 2FA or MFA, two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. Basically, these are using a means to verify the identity of the user via a channel or band that is outside of the channel being used as the primary means of verification. What the heck did he just say? Well, basically, what that means is you are using an independent means of authenticating the user's identity in addition to the first one. So let's say the user is first prompted to enter a password, as you've been doing for 15 years. Okay. Now you're basically adding another, like, unrelated or unconnected, if you will, layer of protection. Typically, 2FA is when you combine something you know, which would be the password that you memorized. Sometimes you'll hear the term memorized secret. So you're combining something you know, the password, with something you have. That have, or what you have, could be temporary and perishable PIN code sent to the user's phone via text message or SMS. It could be a card that you insert into a slot on the computer, or a card reader accessory. Some of these verification codes can be sent via email too. There are many other forms of 2FA, such as Google Authenticator, which is nice because if someone attempts to hack into your Gmail, you will get a notification sent to your phone. And as we all know, we're never separated from our phones anymore. So your phone is basically the key to unlock your account for normal two-factor authentication if using that service. And I do bring up Google and Gmail because many companies that I deal with use Gmail for business. Now, for enterprise-wide 2FA to be implemented, there will, of course, be a cost factor. If you cannot justify that cost factor enterprise-wide at this time, at least begin a discussion with decision makers and in the IT department to perhaps at least attach 2FA authentication to those accounts that hold sensitive information within your company. But to do this, you do have to ensure that the data and applications you deem sensitive are in fact off limits to those that do not use or should not have access, who do not use 2FA to log into the network or the application or whatever it is. Now, typically MFA typically refers to a third option or layer, or the use of biometrics, but can also be used interchangeably with 2FA because it's more than one, all right, no big deal. But typically, MFA refers to the incorporation of biometrics into the authentication process. These could include facial recognition, retina, and fingerprint scans. So the cost factor here will be higher than the other options we talked about previously. But again, perhaps you can consider using these to strengthen the authentication process for those users that have access to sensitive information. So 2FA, again, generally refers to something you know plus something you have, whereas MFA refers to, or if you go with 3 layers, typically refers to something you are, your fingerprint, your eye, etc. Now, before we proceed, I just want to touch on MSC 4.9 briefly, which discusses remote connectivity. Let me tell you, with so many teleworking due to the virus right now, this is obviously front and center. And there are certainly, this is certainly a big issue right now out there on the dark web, as well as what we call topside on the surface web. There's enhanced risk associated with so many people being teleworking, working remotely now. It's kind of almost like a hacker's paradise from what I read and see. Anyway, if you have workers connecting through remote connections, you will need to use a virtual private network or VPN connection. And most of the more well-known and top-rated VPN providers require at least 2FA by default, which would benefit your company and keep you in line with our criteria. I plan on talking more about remote connections and VPNs in another presentation. Okay. So now for the final subpart of our MSC. Okay. Passwords, passphrases, PIN codes, all must be changed if there is evidence of compromise. But this does come with some additional points. First, something that I have been harping on for years, and now NIST in 2017 basically said the same thing, that employees need to have clear, readily accessible instructions on what to do if they need to change their password. They should know who to go to and what information they should be asked to provide versus what they should not be required to provide. For instance, a pretty high-profile hacking incident involving the St. Louis Cardinals was affected because a baseball scout was asked to hand in his laptop along with the password when he left the ball club. Well, the manager that he handed it off to was the one that asked for that. And that manager basically knew that the scout changed his passwords in a predictable manner. Now, the details are just a bit more complicated than that, but the gist of it is that employees should never divulge their passwords to anyone, nor should they be asked for their passwords via any other means, such as email, a phone call, etc. This is not normal, and it's not acceptable practice. Now, I say it's not normal, but this is something that I see at least 3 to 5 times a year, usually overseas, but again, it is prevalent. It's just not widely seen as being acceptable is really what I should say. So they need to be made aware of this, employees, your foreign business partners, etc. And I say this again because it still happens all the time. They should not post their passwords on their monitors. I see this too. Okay, I've been to companies where there were Post-it notes all around the monitor with things crossed out and then something that wasn't crossed out. And I asked the person there, is that your password? And she said, yeah. And all those other ones were her prior passwords. And sure enough, there was a common theme to all her passwords. Okay. All default passwords for devices, printers, 3D printers, CCTV networks, etc., all should be changed as soon as possible. I still validate companies that fail to change their CCTV password from the default one that was shipped with the unit or requirement. I still have companies that use password with the A substituted with an ampersand to log into their servers. I saw that last year when the IT guy kneeled down by me to log into his server. He opened up his little black book because he couldn't remember, I guess, password 1. I said, please don't tell me that is the server password, and it was. Needless to say, his manager was not at all pleased. So instruct employees to not be predictable with their passwords when they change them. Companies should use automated means to restrict employees from reusing prior passwords. A rate limiting mechanism should be implemented to limit the number of failed authentication attempts to protect against guessing attacks. And finally, re-authentication of user identity should be repeated following any period of activity lasting 15 minutes or longer. Okay, meaning the computer is not being used, touched, nothing's being typed, the mouse isn't being moved for 15 minutes, they should be locked out and have to reauthorize their identity or re-verify their identity. And in all actuality, NIST uses the word shall for this, but that is for government agencies. So I strongly encourage you all to implement this. I still see computers on and glowing unsecured for hours during validations. Also, all users should be required to reauthorize after any 12-hour period. And that's to prevent the computers from being taken over and used by hackers basically all weekend or on long holidays or long holiday periods, like a 4-day holiday type of thing. And this slide is just a recap. I think I did cover all this. I'd apologize for that. Okay, now, password managers are not mentioned in the actual criteria, but I want to let everyone know about them. I don't see as many people using them as I'd like, but they do a few things for you. If you use a lot of legacy type passwords, like we talked about near the beginning, for say over 20 accounts, and by the way, I meet people regularly that have over 100 passwords to memorize. One guy told me actually just last year that he has to know about 140. Password managers not only make it easy to store your passwords, but they can also create very strong and long passwords that fit with all the current guidance set out by NIST. Okay, you want to look for truly end-to-end encryption like AES 256. AES 256 is basically a global accepted standard for end-to-end or E2E encryption. I say true end-to-end because some companies say they offer it, but in all actuality, they're not. That recently came to light when a popular live video meeting app was hacked. A lot. Anyway, what end-to-end encryption means is that the packet of information is encrypted on your device, sent through the app provider servers, and remains encrypted through to the legitimate recipient. Okay? The vendor providing the service, the app, does not actually hold the cryptographic keys to decrypt your data. Don't worry, if you go to well-regarded review sites or popular like PC sites, computer sites, etc., they will tell you which services are offering this protection for you. To get into a password manager, you at least want to have a solid 2FA authentication, which again, most of the legit top-of-the-line password managers provide by default. But again, I think I did cover this a little or touch on this a little bit previously. I do see some providers that either allow you to turn that off, and I see people not using the full 2FA potential. A good password manager will also store the URLs or what is the web addresses of those sites that the user needs on a regular basis. This helps cut down on the possibility that the user will click on a malicious link or image in a phishing email. So, further reading, these are some government agencies, these are some resources online that I go to, that I have used, that I have handed out, that I've gotten good feedback on over the years. I still hand these out to companies all the time. And these are links to additional resources. Most of these are government-backed, or they are operating under government funding, government grants. And I use all these regularly. I send these out to companies when they have specific questions. I send these out to our own specialists. Okay. And in future presentations, I plan on doing the next one on what I call defense, but that will be 4.2. I'm actually going to go in through 2 or 3 actual hacking incidents that are very relatable to CTPAT and not just cyber. You're going to see how physical security, physical access controls, employee behavior has a lot to do with how these hacks were effected or made possible. You're going to really be surprised at what you see could have been done if these companies were properly following the CTPAT criteria. Then I'm going to go into 12.8 in another presentation for cybersecurity training. So let me go back to that. I apologize. And the reason I'm going over this is because if some of you want to send me ideas, if you want to some of you want to send me some incidents or some even best practices that or procedures that you have in place that are you feel are best practices or we already identified as such, I will be more than happy to take a look at that. And if it fits, I will put it in the presentation. So feedback on this presentation is welcome. I know it was a little long. I don't think the next ones will be as long, but you know, I didn't want to break this up into 5 little parts because as we put out more videos, I didn't want to get it too confusing with 4 or 5 videos on just one criterion. So I figured we're going to be posting this on YouTube. You'll be able to start and stop and come back to it as many times as you like. I know you're all busy, so I thought that this would be the best avenue to release these videos, not only to our CTPAT partners directly, but then you can all send this to your partners that are not in the program. And with that, I will close out the presentation. Thank you.